So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the July 2024 session of the Richmond Art Gallery's Artist Salon series. My name is Kathy Tycholis. I am the Richmond Art Gallery's Education and Public Programs Narrator, and I'm here today to host your program and to moderate your questions. First, on behalf of the Richmond Art Gallery Association, I would like to welcome you to this program hosted by the Richmond Art Gallery, which is located on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Hunkaminam-speaking peoples, which are the nations that lived along the Fraser River Delta, including the Musqueam. And I would like to thank you all out there for joining us from wherever you are zooming in from and supporting the Richmond Art Gallery's programs. In a few moments, I will welcome our guest artist presenter, Fegor Obuwoma. But before we begin, a few housekeeping notes about the program and tonight's session. So for those of you who might be new to the Artist Salon, this program is a monthly series of free talks and events by arts professionals hosted currently. We've gone back to our schedule of the last Wednesday evening of each month from February to November. The goal of the program is to offer visual artists a mix of professional development tips and advice, along with artists' personal stories and experiences to help strengthen and build our artist community. We hope the program helps nurture relationships between artists as a way to make connections in the community and to encourage artists to keep on making and growing in your art practice. The Salon also exists as a private Facebook group, which provides resources for artists mainly in the Lower Mainland, such things as artist calls for exhibitions, for residencies, professional development opportunities, local arts events, and also serves as a space for you out there if you wanted to connect with one another to share your own openings and events. So I welcome you to join our Facebook group and share your events with each other. You can find out more about that on our website. You can also see it's been posted in the chat, both our website and the Facebook page link. So I would like to introduce our artist, Fegor Obuwoma, who is also one of the exhibiting artists in our current exhibition. It Begins with Knowing and Not Knowing, that is on now until September 29th, 2024. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Fegor. I was really excited to have Fegor on our program because I've been seeing her name pop up a lot over the past few years, both as an artist and an arts worker for shows and events. So I was really curious about this emerging artist. I often get asked by emerging artists, how do I make it? How do I become a professional artist? And I don't think there's one answer. I think every artist has their own journey, their own path. It's especially in the art world where everyone is so different in the way they work and the things that they're interested in. But I do think a key component is to finding your own art community. And I think Fegor is a really good example of someone who is really active as both an artist and a community builder within the arts community. So I thought she would be a great guest to start up this conversation and share how she's found her way in becoming a professional artist and arts worker. So I'm going to just quickly introduce you all out there to Fegor via short bio, and then I'll let her share her own story and artwork with us for what I know will be a great talk. And then we will follow that with a Q&A with our audience out there. So Fegor Obuwoma, they is a Nigerian storyteller, writer, and arts worker with a BFA in film and communications from Simon Fraser University. A key question in their practice is, what does it mean to be a body in relationship to this world and time? Their work as an artist and writer emerges from an investigation of questions of the body and self as it relates to the nuanced and ever-changing state of contemporary Nigerian society and culture. In exploring these ideas of self and community, she utilizes concepts of African futurisms and a visual language derived from lived experience and the vastness of the spiritual. Fegor grounds their practice in traditions of care and reimagination and lives in Vancouver on the unceded Coast Salish lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So welcome, Fegor. I'm so happy to have you here. I will fade off into the background and come back after your presentation to moderate questions from our audience. Again, a reminder, you can send us your questions at any time throughout the session. So I will just leave it over to you, Fegor.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you so much for that amazing introduction. And thank you so much, everyone, for being here. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Oh, so it's like a bit awkward when you don't know what everyone is thinking because you can't see their faces. So yeah, feel free to like put anything in the chat if you want me to go back or say something again, or if you miss something, or if I cut off at any point. So I just made this slide, and this is like I kind of want to put like a few screenshots, and this is mainly screenshots on this slide and some quotes and just things that are interesting to me as an artist and an art worker. So I'm just going to introduce myself for everyone. So my name is Fegor Obuwoma. I'm a Nigerian storyteller, as I say, but also that means I'm a filmmaker, I'm a writer, I'm an arts worker, and all of these different aspects of my practice for me are so interconnected. And like Kathy said, a major question in my practice is what does it mean to be a body in relation to this world and time? And my notes are here because I'm looking off to the side. And so that question for me has multiple different layers. It's thinking very much about what it means to be a body, but always also thinking about the nuanced experience of being a Black body, of being like someone who's fat, of being someone who isn't living in Nigeria but is from Nigeria, and what that means as like a Black person, that means as like a body that's traveled across the world to be here today. And for me, a lot of the language of my film work kind of emerges from there, but also into many investigations into like futurisms, into spirituality as like a visual as a visual way of understanding a work, and also like questions around around being a body that comes a lot from the works of artists that are thinking through fat liberation, and are thinking through like disability justice, and so there are many different aspects of my work that I am like thinking of the work that's become before me, and and that like is really important for me. So I've put these 4 images from 4 different films that I've made. And the first film is at the top with the first film at the top is In Memory of Who We Were, and this is the film that's part of the show at the Richmond Art Gallery. And for me, I'm trying to also find these like those tiny moments of like cultural understanding. For me, it's like something like a candle that has this very blurry image of like, I believe it's Jesus. And so that kind of, for me, calls back memories of like, I went to an all girls Catholic boarding school. So that was so deeply entrenched into that film, which I'll talk more about later. And another film of mine, Libations, where she's in the scene, a friend of mine who plays the main character is kind of covered in palm oil. And that was like kind of interesting to me. What is it like? How is she using it? How does it spread? When palm oil is typically a very popular Nigerian cooking, part of Nigerian cooking. But I kind of want to explore like it's something that you're meant to cook with, but what happens when it's on the body? So there's also this for me like performative aspect of my work when I'm interested in like gestures, movements, kind of playing with things and putting things where they shouldn't be. And also like for me, when I'm thinking about this idea of futurity, Afrofuturism, world building, myth making, kind of directing the visual aspects of my film, I'm trying to create those moments of almost uncomfortability or unexpectedness that feels so inherent to like my own experience. Um, and these 2 films at the bottom, one of them is called Death Life, a Self-Portrait, and the other one is a film I made when I went back home that isn't really titled. And so in the film at the bottom, I'm using maps and some of my writing to for that image in particular. And this one here is like an image of an auntie of mine sewing. So it's just like for me to make work, I have to bring in all these various elements of like documentary, performance, a kind of exploring different avenues for telling a story. And just like more about my work is what's really important to me from making work that feels true to me is having fun, making work that's interesting, not only to me, but to like my larger community of Nigerians or people that are experiencing the same things that I am, or like my Black queer community. So for me, I don't feel like I can ever make work in isolation. So every work that I make is, I love to do interviews with friends to ask them what they think about stuff. For the film with the poem that's there, I did an interview with my dad. So in the actual film, there's like our conversation weaves itself through the film. So I think for me, art can't be made without this aspect of collaboration, of working with people that you're close to, people you may never have met, family, friends. And this also is kind of what happens because half of my films are usually my friends acting in it, or me, or performing. So that's kind of like a brief intro into like kind of my interest. And the rest of the talk, I've kind of divided it based off of my interest and investigations in my art practice. But I feel like in general, what influences my art practice also influences like how I relate to community, how I exist as an arts worker. Those values in my work are things I also hope and try to uphold in my lived experience every day. Um, so so the first thing I would like to talk about is this idea of futurity. And I'm thinking about this a lot, like I think about in my work, but I'm thinking about this a lot, especially because I was recently part of this leadership training called Reflect that was done by GVPTA, the Culture, and the City of Vancouver. And we ended like this 1 year leadership program that we had been doing since last June with like short presentations. And what I presented on was the idea of futurity. Is it possible in a workplace? And I was thinking through this using the gesturing towards decolonial futures kind of mandate and the kind of guiding principles they set for themselves, which I did not include, and also the introduction to the undercommons. And this is really what I want to share from that introduction. If there is no church in the wild, if there is study rather than knowledge production, if there is a way of being together in brokenness, if there's an undercurrent, then we must all find our way to it. And it will not be where the wild things are. It will be a place where refuge is not necessary, and you find that you were already in it all along. And I kind of want to talk a bit about like how futurity is like important to my practice in thinking about how like for me the term futurity is something that's existing beyond this present moment. And I'm thinking of how to make art that's nodding to something that isn't yet present, isn't yet here. And a big part of like how I move through my artistic practice and also like my practice as an arts worker is to know that not knowing is so important. I think in like the arts in general, there's this kind of need or push or drive to know everything there is or pretend that you do. But I found that like I've been able to grow more by not knowing things and just being honest about it, and trying to learn from that position and trying to make work from that position and trying to think of unknowability and impossibility as a practice. And in this introduction to the undercommons, Jack Halsenburst, uh, Halberstam is talking about this idea of the otherwise, which is like something that isn't here yet, but it's something that we're moving towards. And for me, what this means for me is I'm thinking of like what does this feel like in a workplace? Is dreaming a possibility in when you do work, when you do arts work? I'll show you like I think a lot of people do arts work with like a genuine love for it. So because it's not paying that well most times. So I think like it's definitely work that you go into loving already. So more or less like, is there a possibility to dream within this? Is futurity a practice of imagining better, of imagining possibilities that are not yet here? And so in my film, how I'm addressing things like this is thinking of world building and myth making as such important parts of imagining the future, of turning what is known right now on its head. So when for the still here is from in memory of who we were, and that film was about like an experience in my past, but I was trying to almost create a film where I didn't feel like I was putting as much of my pain into it, but instead I was looking at this traumatic experience from a lens, from a distance, and from a comfortable distance at that. So it kind of uses a lot of dreams, a lot of like poetry and a tiny bit of like kind of vagueness and illegibility that I think is necessary because not everything to me has to be accessible to everyone. And this is an experience I've also learned by being an artist in the city. I'm making films from a different point of view. Like I feel like after there are certain films I've made and then I've gone to see the work in like a gallery and been like, there's a certain group that's coming to this gallery and this and technically and these groups of people tend to be like white people that are consuming like content from people of color. And so what is some ways to still keep the work that I make like important and relevant to Black people in the city, or like have these moments that only they can understand? And for me, that film was a film that was like purposefully illegible, but in the end, like I think grief is something that everyone kind of feels, so it feels like relevant to everyone in a sense. And okay, so the next part or segment that I want to talk about is this idea of spirituality in my practice. And this is kind of like one aspect of my practice that I struggle a lot with in thinking through. Like for me, spirituality is a very vast concept, and the idea of the spiritual is like really vast. And also I often refer to it like as the spiritual as something that's vast. Because for me, in the top image is from the film I just finished making from a residency at Gallery Gachet called Geographies of Longing. And these images are from Google Maps, and it's images from my secondary school. And so and it was a Catholic school, so in a sense, that work is about the spiritual, but it's about like the trauma of it and kind of how it shapes, identity, it shapes everything in your life after. Then on the side is from my film Libations, where it's actually about reclaiming spiritual practices. In this scene, like the actor like breaks kola nuts and drinks palm wine, and it's kind of a film about ritual, about this practice of trying even though you're disconnected from culture. And then the bottom is from my film Our Masquerades, and it's about the journey of a masquerade through an urban setting, which is my friend. We dressed up as a masquerade and we're walking through Burnaby Mountain. And for me, that film felt very much like a performance piece that was just documented because we had cars stop to be like, oh, what are you doing? And and it was like a great, and all these ways for me, I put all these different ways because they're all different ways that I'm kind of addressing kind of spirituality as something that's huge and expansive in my work. Um, and being Nigerian also means that spirituality is heavily embedded in daily life, not just as religion, but also in the ways we like form superstition, how bodies move through space and time, how you position and gesture. There are all these different ways that to me, I can see that and be like, oh, that feels like a spiritual experience. Um, and for me, this spirituality is connected to futurity, is connected to everything that I do, because spirituality is this almost belief in the possibility of the unknown, and that there's something to be uncovered, or there's something you kind of put yourself into without knowing if it's real. And for me, I think there's something amazing about being able to put yourself towards something that is not here yet, is not happening yet. And I think of spirituality definitely as something that's metaphysical and also like a bodily investigation. And it's also about trusting as well. And this thinking about spirituality in such a concrete way, because for me, I first started to think about this through this idea of like what I was calling at the time, and I still do, spiritual aesthetics. And it was a way for me to kind of try and understand some tropes in Nigerian cinema and also like in Nigerian art, where you would see like people who didn't really necessarily practice a religion have a lot of these religious symbols and imagery. And so I was thinking about why that was. And then I started doing, and then something I got into the residency at Art Speak, and that was my proposal initially for this idea of spiritual aesthetics, to curate something about that and what that means. And when I started doing my research into thinking of this idea of spiritual aesthetics, I kind of got instead into this idea of why spiritual aesthetics, or like more like why it happens, as opposed to like why it's manifesting in the work, or rather they're connected, but like just I kind of got more into why and where it comes from. And I started to think through this idea of like how can I, first of all, as a Black person, navigate a world that's often so hostile. And that was a way for me to like talk about pain, to talk about trauma, was to also talk about these impossible things, or to like make myth, to world build. So I started to like kind of read more about what people were kind of thinking about that. And so it was, for me, it was like I started to define it for myself, this idea of spiritual aesthetics, as a way for Black people all across the diaspora to think, to manage, and to live within like often unfathomable situations of Blackness. And not having necessarily the word for saying it in the ways I expected, or to speak about pain so directly. And this is like this definitely is so popular in like genres like Afro surrealism, where like the surreal is used to explain these unfathomable ideas and realities. So to me, that was like that was really interesting for me to think about spirituality as like kind of in the end more like a coping mechanism visually. And also another thing that kind of I got up to between last year and this year was thinking of I had a program at VIF called To Glimpse African Cinema Now. And I had done like some research while I was at SFU about how cinema is inherently colonial by its existence, and also this idea of like the Black body as film material to be looked at even when we're not watching film, and kind of what film then means for watching, and the possibility of like allowing people watch Black bodies freely in a way that isn't like great. So I was thinking about these ideas, and that's kind of where like on the more hand, like the program at VIF kind of came out from, like expanding a bit more on that and thinking about this idea of like a spiritual aesthetic. So I started into this kind of investigation into what that is for me, and how this visual language that exists post and true colonial experiences right now on the continent is kind of highlighting a vernacular, which I'm reading from that separates the body, the reality, and the being from Western imagination. So again, this idea of illegibility is really important to me. And let me see, is that all I want to say? And yeah, also just this idea about how Black artists are making and theorizing and thinking from this place of unknowability that I've talked previously about inviting into my work and my practice. And which is, I think, like, it's very important. And also, like, before I go to the next slide, this idea for me of thinking about spirituality, and I'll also go into soon a part of my practice where I also think about death. But this idea of like spirituality and death that I think of, really, I have to cite, comes from Akwaeke Emezi, who when I read their first book, Fresh Water, a few years ago now, they start off that book by saying, to those of us with one foot on the other side. And I've kind of been obsessed since then to think about what this other side is. And it's kind of definitely defining this unknowability for me. There is something that isn't here yet, isn't accessible, isn't knowable. And what is this visually? And what does it do in the world? And what does illegibility do? What does it do for Black people? What does it do for queer people? What does it do for Black queer people in the world? And how is it necessary? So I'll go to the next one. Slide. Moving on. Okay. So the next aspect of my work that's really important to me as well is this idea of the body. And I've included some quotes here from Hunter Shackelford, and they wrote this really amazing book on like not book, but this reading on like what it means to when you become cyborg, like black black, oh, I forgot the name, but like if you put in their name, you'll be able to see what they've written about being Black and being fat. And these are two quotes from that they're writing. What does it mean when you're already dead, yet there's a warrant to assure the death of your flesh? The second one is, what if being dead is not the worst or the final thing you can be when anti-Blackness is a system designed to be unlivable? So for me, this idea of like being a body is really at the heart of my practice, because the question and investigation of my practice is, what does it mean to be a body in relation to this world and time? I feel like I've said that a lot, but so I'm always thinking about what does it mean to be a body, how a body is expected to behave, and what happens when you're a body that doesn't behave, or when your body doesn't behave by its inherent existence. And so Shackelford is talking very deeply about systemic anti-Blackness as it relates to fat phobia, and the ways that Blackness is already a situation in which death is oftentimes imminent and oftentimes already there. And then when one is also fat, they're already inherently dead by definition, because their body is not giving any moment to live. And I think, like, to me, this is really important in my practice. Like, this kind of work is coming out of fat liberation movements, coming out of disability justice movements, where a lot of amazing people are thinking about how to exist in a world that does not want you to be here. And specifically from a lot of like Black people who are thinking about this multiple layers of non-existence, of non-being here almost. And so this kind of ties itself to everything I'm kind of investigating. A future is one that is livable for Black people. Spirituality is something that is dealing with the unknowable, the unfathomable, and the body is existing within all of this for me. So there's just like many ways that I've kind of thought about this idea of a body, this idea of death, and this idea of death for me as being almost pedagogy, as a way of teaching us about life, and as a practice of life. Even within something like death that feels so final, there's much to learn from when you're completely discredited or completely thrown aside or like vanquished, that there is something to be known about that positionality, and hopefully something to build from that, or somewhere to go. So like I said before, like my practice is very much about not knowing. I love to not know till I read something that I'm like, oh, great, this gives word to what I've been thinking about or the ways that I'm thinking about something. And I want to read a few more quotes that to me kind of hold this idea for me, yeah. And some, like one is really long and one is like a bit more short. And the first one is also by Sďwməthkվəy. I have lived many lives inside this body. I have lived many lives before they put me in this body. I will live many lives when they take me out of it. For me, it's like this idea of like, take you to where, you know? And even though a lot of my practice hinges around this idea of the spiritual, I'm not that much of a spiritual person, so it's interesting, kind of how I'm thinking about it. But I do have like a practice of believing in what isn't here yet. And I don't know if that is a spiritual experience, but maybe it is what I'm thinking. And Billy Ray Belcourt also writes, the body remembers when the world broke open. So there's this kind of embodied knowledge that interests me, this idea of bodily archives, of what a body can say, how it gestures through time and space, how it situates itself, how it is situated by uncontrollable forces. So in the end, I'm kind of thinking about a lot of these ideas of what is this experience of being a Black person, a Black body across the diaspora, and how as the horrors of the past through colonization, the transatlantic slave trade, ongoing horrible conditions for Black people around the world, capitalism, how is all of this affecting bodies, about how we perceive them and how we treat them? So that's a lot, but that's some things I'm thinking about in relation to bodies, and this also definitely ties into what's happening at Art Speak with the show that I'm curating called If Spirits Have Eyes Toward Longing. That'll be opening in October. And something I've written about it I would like to share is like this sort of I'm thinking about all these aspects of the spiritual that happen in city spaces as urban magic. This sort of urban magic that happens in city spaces away from a certain cultural reference, that religion, spirituality, and ideas of the magical become intertwined to define existence because of the often unexplainable state of systemic oppression, from forceful removals of bodies in service to capital, from continent or location to location. So just to say that in the end, like capitalism is really defining a lot of our relationships to bodies. And I want to share a bit about In Memory of Who We Were, which is showing at the Richmond Art Gallery, but I feel like maybe not a lot as I thought I would. I do want to like leave some time for questions. So, but this film for me is like a film that a lot of people always really relate so hard to, and I'm always like shocked by it because it's about a very certain kind of experience of a Nigerian boarding school. In the top image, the blurred out video at the back is from like my archives from that time. So it's me and classmates, but it's also blurred out to be respectful, but also like to kind of distance again, like I said, from that moment in time. And the image at the bottom is like just after this white entity, I call them the white and Black entity, has like stuffed food through their veil. And that's thinking through a lot of ideas of like just eating and what that means, what that meant at that time, what that means now, how everyone kind of finds it hard to talk about issues of the body and eating. And there's so much struggle around that, and that kind of reflects that inability to almost talk about it, but instead to like to hide it, to shove it down. But this film came out of like a lot of dreams I was having during the pandemic, and definitely this idea of myth making from the stories that I'd heard in secondary school. And there's like a really amazing, I would have brought like a copy, but the Richmond Art Gallery like compiled like different like statements from all the artists, and it's in the book on like the artist practice, and some of what I like shared with Zoe, the curator, is also part of that. But it's about like dreams, it's about kind of putting pain into something that's visual, but also isn't as painful if you watch it visually. And it happened in my apartment with my roommates, with like the use of like set dressing to mimic Nigerian like festivities, green screen, just different aspects to kind of create a world and world build something that isn't really possible, and kind of make this world this from an experience to make a world from an experience, if that makes sense. And yeah, and this film definitely holds a lot of like my interest and what I'm thinking of in my entire practice. And I know I haven't really talked about my arts. I felt like I would be able to easily like talk about also where my arts worker background kind of ties into it. But like I feel like with all these interests that I have into thinking about people and bodies and the intersections between all of this, that kind of in the end feeds itself into how I think of my relationships with others, about thinking about how to care for one another, how to exist in spaces of reimagination, um, of like, I don't ever want to experience the world how it's expected to be. Like, I mean, sorry, the art world, how it's expected to be. I'm always like curious if we can do it in a way that's better. And then this is from a film that I just made as part of my the 8 month long kind of residency that I did with three other artists. Was it three other artists? Yeah, at Gallery Gachet. And it's called Geographies of Longing. And I kind of thought it would be great to share it at the end because it's a film that's like very much about the body. It comes from the idea of body mapping that emerges from South Africa for women to think through like what it means to have AIDS and being a body, to like a body that's dying, but also a body that has so much stories, that has also held so much and helped you through so much. So that's kind of what this film is about, but through it, I think about a diasporic experience of moving across space to different places, but also just about moving within Nigeria quite a lot. And these are some images that I've taken from it, and I've used green screen in the past on skin, but I really want to like do more as it like to think about that in my practice. So I did like a lot of I was on the map, the Google Maps and everything so much. And I was trying to like find all these places from my childhood while also not encountering these places at all, because Google Maps in Nigeria is unreliable. It is like mostly unmapped. So also like then contending with the absence, but then also finding like unexpected gems where I'm like, oh, I actually was able to find my childhood home that's like kind of on the face here. But I wasn't able to find my grandmother's home where I spent a lot of time in. So also like even with something like Google Maps, it exposes a lot of the systemic unfairness of the world, even through mapping. Who gets to be mapped and how you're mapped and who even cares, right? Um, and the state of the map from, because I'm from Warri, in Delta State, Nigeria, is like just really not there. But that's kind of where this film comes from. And then this screenshot at the bottom is from this quotes, and the book that shows through the sliver of my back is from Ben Okri's The Famished Road. And this you can probably tell by now, I love a good intro to a book because nearly everything I've read has been like an intro or a title. And like I just love this idea of like this world that's where everything starts for this certain group of spirits, but it's not where everything starts. It's not a place, but it's a place. And so I always want to think of this idea of like, what is anything? Like I'm critical of if these places I'm thinking of are places and if they're not, and how they're places and what this means. And I was thinking of like this idea of a river becoming a road, and what that means for Black people across the diaspora, and that movement of bodies through roads that are rivers, and the trauma of that and of all of that, and how we get to move through rivers and roads now, and how that still holds a lot of those same trauma and like pains. So yeah, so that's kind of what what I just finished working on, and I'm going to like my hope is to my next kind of film work is to kind of now that I've kind of explored more like what this visual language for the spiritual is, like how can I implement that through performance in my work. So yeah, that's kind of what that's at. And I did also want to say that I think like my approach to moving through the arts world is to just try. It's not really helpful, but I feel like everyone knows this in some capacity, that there is always people who believe in the possibility of what you can do as opposed to what you've done. And so I just like apply for everything. And I keep being interested and curious, and I keep finding ways to draw things to one another, because I find that things are way more interconnected than they're not. And I think it's great to like get to work with people who are interested in your work and whose work you're interested in back in return. Um, and I found that to be like a lot of like my favorite parts of being in the art world here. One of the first shows that my film in memory of who we were was at the Nigerian Art Gallery, and it was like co-curated by the Black Arts Center, which I'm also on the board of. So it was just like which I'm on the board of now, and it was just like such a great experience to know like organizations like that exist in the city, or like they're still young, are growing in the city, and like what that means. And that's like what interests me in working in the arts, that these organizations and people who make them possible like gets to happen. So I so that's it. And we can do questions.
Thank you so much, Fegor. That was great. It was so nice to see all the mix of your work. I'm going to say something like what Zoe, our curator, has said. I love how you bring in all these different threads from your life and networks to create your own hybrid aesthetic. And I definitely think you showed that throughout the entire slideshow. So it was really nice to see that, sort of that little history of you and what you've been doing and what you will be doing. And before I jump into, I just want to, if anyone has questions, please put them into the Q&A as well as the chat, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. So far, it's just people complimenting you and saying how great your work is. But yeah, so my question was, because you touched on it talking about your art's work. And I think one of the comments you said that jumped out at me was the possibilities of what is not yet here. And you talk about that a lot in your artwork, but how do you see that playing out in the type of arts work as an arts worker, whether it's a curator or a writer? How do you think that would, like, what is your possibilities, I guess? What are the possibilities you are looking for?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that question. I think for me, that's like I was having a conversation with a friend who also works in the arts, and we were like, how can we dream in the arts? And that was like something that we're like, oh, what does this even mean? Like, what does that even mean to be able to dream in the arts? I kind of my biggest need like want for the arts is like like I think it's the exploitation is always like I think what everyone kind of addresses, and it's so true. Like how can we make art that's like respectful of one another? What are we dreaming about? Are we dreaming about something that's better? And when I think about what is not here, I think about like what is a system of making art that isn't exhaustive for the artist, that isn't like something that's like again and again, do it again and again and again. For me, I love residencies that like take 1 year, take 8 months. Like I love to take my time to think alongside everyone else. So for me, I think like what isn't here yet is like how do we do that when also there's the crunch of time, there's funding, there are the ways that these systems are already set up to fail us. So I think for me, that's what I'm saying. Like there are many ways for us to like do that in micro ways that I feel like maybe become like bigger things. But for me, that's kind of what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about how to dream, how not to exploit, how to love what you do. And I also have like a film background because I did a film-ish background. Because I did film at SFU, and film is so notorious for exploiting people's time, people's bodies, and for like taking that for granted. So when I make film work, I want to make sure everyone is fed. I want to make sure like everyone laughs at least twice. And like everyone is having fun making the work, because I always feel like I always feel like when that doesn't happen, that also shows through the work as well. And it might not like in very like noticeable ways for other people, but I can tell that, you know, it didn't work out in my work, and that would make me feel so.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm going to get to the one question that we have so far from Michael. Fegor, this is such an amazing talk. Thank you. Had a comment question on film as traditionally a linear storytelling medium with successive images and sounds. Part of what really strikes me about your practice is how you turn on its head what is known, as you said, including how we, in the West at least, conceive of space and time and how the universe works as linear, stable, or knowable. Do you find yourself reckoning or trying to subvert this linearity of film? And if how so? Is it through this purposeful illegibility that you discussed?
Thank you, Michael. That's a great question. I think like yeah, you definitely like have hit it on the head. Like for me, being illegible is as important as being legible, because I think there's a balance to strike. It's never about being illegible in a way that people can't access art. It's about being illegible in a way that people from my community can access it first and fastest. And so for me, I think film is something that when you plan to shoot it, it feels very linear, and it feels like you need to do this to get to this, to get to this, to get to that. But then I feel like when you edit it, it then kind of shows itself as something that's kind of hybrid in that sense, and isn't, and it's non-linear. And that's kind of for me where that like turning things on its head or making something feel like you recognize it but you don't kind of comes into play, because the film is shot to be like something that's linear, that makes sense from 1 to 2 to 3, but then when the editing happens, it happens from 5 to 4 to 6 to 7, you know. So then it kind of gives an opportunity to play with things and situate things in a way that for me is feels more important and kind of tells a story that isn't maybe spelt out but is felt. So I think like you said, it's true this illegibility, but it's not an illegibility that's trying to like alienate people from the work, but more like it's playing with itself also.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's definitely something I see in your work is there's a mystery kind of to it, yet it's also very readable. Like I'm just thinking so far from my experiences of your work in the gallery and seeing other people's reactions to it, like, yeah, there's a lot of questions to it, but at the same time, there's so many people that are very attracted to it and understand it. So yeah, you're doing, so basically you're doing a great job is what I'm trying to say. Like you really do play with that, you know, those two worlds of that eligibility, you know, legible and not legible at the same time. So other questions. Can you talk more about your future curatorial project that you mentioned? I know that was the one on spiritual aesthetics. How do you want it to look and feel?
Oh, that one's so hard because I feel like I've been thinking about it for a while, but I'm still also like, oh, like curating is not easy. I'm like, this is so hard. But so that project, If Spirits Have Eyes Toward Longing, has been like I've been working on it for almost like a year plus now at Art Speak as part of my residency. And it's kind of for me been like, look, it's a bit of it is like kind of like, okay, what idea of this work speaks to me as this spiritual aesthetic, which most times you'd see artists already kind of hinting at the metaphysical already, which is always like a great sign for me when I've like looked at artists' work. I'm like, oh, you're talking about the metaphysical. That means something that isn't really here, you know? So that's like a great way for me to think about it, this idea of like what isn't really here. Also memory. So for me, memory also gets like kind of put into that category for me. So I'm like, oh, if an artist is talking about something that's metaphysical, it's talking about a spirit, like an actual spirit, then I'm like, oh, a spirit isn't really here. If they're talking about memory, memory isn't something that's happening right now. It's something that isn't here as well. So it's trying to strike a balance between being like, okay, this is not existing in linear, understandable ways as kind of a definition for how I'm thinking about the exhibition. And also trying not to be like, this isn't existing. I'm putting that on the artist's work. So it's also been good to like just do like studio visits with artists, and they're just like, oh, memory, and I'm like, or they say something, I'm like, oh yeah. So I think like that exhibition, how kind of I'm hoping that it looks is like something that isn't as like it isn't as like everything doesn't look the same, because I feel like there are these different approaches. So my hope is that it doesn't all feel the same. It feels a bit haunting as well. I'm also like I wouldn't say like I think about hauntings as much in my work, but like I think hauntings are also an interesting way of thinking about this as well. And yeah, I'm excited for like also actually I'm excited for what it looks like. um I like, you know, like I think it's changing all the time. Artists like want a different way of their work showing, and then sometimes they actually make a new iteration and they're like, actually don't show the old iteration. So all of that is like interesting for me, and I'm excited to see like how it goes and how it takes shape. And it will happen in October. We don't have an opening date yet, but it's definitely going to be in October. And yeah, I'm excited for it. And there's just other stuff that I'm excited for coming up. There's also like going to be a film screening series again at VIF. So, but this time it won't just be with me. It'll be me and Kika Meme, who curated the Black Futures Month screening at VIF. So it's like for me that was one of the best things I've done this year. Like, I'm like, oh gosh, this is great. How do I now do it with someone else? You know, so I'm always looking for that opportunity for something to not be only something I'm doing as a person, but also sharing that experience with like other Black people, other queer people, and other artists that I'm interested in their work as well, and how they talk about art or film. So yeah, that's a few things coming up.
No, sounds great. Yeah, it does sound exciting. Something that you briefly touched on in your talk, when you mentioned the film you made, walking on Burnaby Mountain, and it turned into a performance. Do you think performance is something you might do in the future or incorporate into like one of your exhibitions?
Oh, that's it. Yeah. Oh my gosh. I'm shy, but like but like I'm always like I think performance is like so huge in like all my films because they're not really narrative. So it's more like what I usually make is like a short list for gestures and how like the body moves as opposed to like a short list for like doing something necessarily. So it's just like I'm like half of the short list is like move your hand across your eyes or something. So I do think like yeah, performance is such a huge part of like my film practice that I know one day I will force myself into probably not being too shy and actually incorporating performance into like my practice more kind of boldly, where like everything I make kind of feels like it's almost behind like a blurry screen where you don't really see faces. Faces are either cut off or like bodies are of more interest or like only eyes or just sides, you know. So I feel like there's something that I'm hinting at but haven't necessarily reached, which I'm okay with. I'm okay with my practice now, like my practice feeling like it's changing in flux, not I would hate if it was there yet.
Sounds great. I mean, I definitely can see you moving in that direction at some point, and whether it's yourself or with, you know, hired actors. I mean, I can definitely see, because you definitely have that component in your work. So yeah, I don't see any other questions unless anyone wants to pop one in, because otherwise we are getting close to the 8 o'clock time. So yes, I think I will call it. And I just wanted to thank you again so much. That was really, for me, really inspiring to see all the work you do and the so many connections that you have, and that you make it all work. Like you just make it all these different ideas and interests that really, yeah, make it all come together. So yes, definitely, you have another 2 months to check out Fegor's work at the Richmond Art Gallery, as well as there are other shows that will be coming up elsewhere in the Lower Mainland. And so for everyone out there, just thank you so much for joining us tonight. If you come back next month on the last Wednesday of the month again, we're going to have another artist that's in the gallery exhibition, Michelle Sound, who will be sharing her journey, which is, again, as I said, every artist is different. So her journey is quite different as a mid-career artist, talking about her journey and where she is now as her career has really been taking off, as just like Fegor's has been taking off recently as well. So it's just so exciting to see these artists and watch their careers blossom. So it's been a real pleasure having you on the show tonight and in the gallery, which I will see tomorrow. So to everyone out there, thank you so much. Thank you, Fegor. And we'll see you again soon, hopefully. Good night.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.